The red light inside the cargo bay cast everything in a muted glow that seemed to pulse with the engine's deep vibration. Paige sat strapped in against the webbing, knees angled to keep her pack steady, while the air around her thrummed with the combined roar of engines and the steady pull of wind through the open side bay door. The scent of hydraulic oil and metal was thick, layered over with the faint tang of aviation fuel, and each breath through the oxygen mask came with a measured pull that she used to keep her pulse steady. The harness straps across her shoulders pressed firm against the fabric of her flight suit, a reminder that every detail of her gear mattered now. She reached up and gave each buckle a second check, gloved fingers pressing against metal catches until she felt the solid click of security. Her altimeter read steady, the needle holding where it should, though she knew that number would drop fast once she stepped out into the night. The weapon harness at her side was cinched tight, the sling folded for speed of access once she hit ground. In the narrow space, bodies shifted against webbing as others in the stick adjusted their own loads, each movement adding to the rustle of straps and the thump of boots against the deck. Across from her, the jumpmaster moved down the line with the precision of habit, eyes scanning each harness, hands occasionally tugging on a strap to tighten it. When he leaned toward her, the words carried over the engine noise in short bursts, just enough to be heard. "The wind was unpredictable tonight," he said, the valley cross-currents changing with each pass. He gave her the timing again, his voice calm and steady, but the lines around his eyes told her he understood how fine that window would be. She nodded once, acknowledging not only the words, but the weight behind them. Through the open bay door, the Iron Valley came into view in shifting frames, visible only when the aircraft's path lined with the jagged ridgeline. The mountains rose like dark teeth against the paling horizon, their slopes cut by faint glimmers that caught the eye before vanishing again. Somewhere down there, enemy crews were working in the dark, tending mortar tubes and adjusting sights. A faint orange flash lit the valley's rim for a heartbeat before being swallowed again by shadow, a reminder that those weapons were already in position. The low fog clung to the valley floor, swirling in small currents where the air cooled fast in the pre-dawn chill. Paige let her breathing settle into the mask's pull, counting each inhale as if it were part of her preparation. Every second before the green light mattered, every movement inside the bay a step in the sequence she had rehearsed in her mind 100 times. She kept her focus on what she could control: the strap tension, the chute placement, the angle of her weapon harness. The threshold between this space and the one beyond the door was a line she would cross soon enough. But until then, she kept her thoughts anchored in the present task. A crackle came over the intercom, the crew chief's voice confirming with the assault wave on the ground net. The first lift was inbound and holding position until she had eyes on the mortar pits. They could not afford to bring the first wave in blind. She listened to the exchange, catching the clipped confirmations, and stored away the timing marks in her head. Every part of her plan hinged on those marks being right. The aircraft gave a small shudder, the tilt of its wings shifting her perspective of the valley through the bay door. They were adjusting for wind, the pilot compensating for what the forecast had warned might be heavy gusts funneling through the mountain passes. The shift made the open door feel less like a frame and more like an invitation to the drop itself. The space beyond drawing her eyes, even when she tried to keep them on her hands. She forced herself to scan the inside of the bay, taking in the faces of those along the line, each one set in the kind of controlled expression that came from knowing the risks without letting them dictate the outcome. She thought briefly of the canopy opening against the dim light, the moment of weightlessness giving way to the pull of the harness. The memory of other jumps surfaced and faded, each one different in its own way, but all sharing the same breathless second when air turned solid beneath her. She had no illusions about what the valley floor would feel like under her boots or how close the enemy's range might be once she was there. The plan was simple in concept, brutal in execution. She would land, move, and set her sights before the first parachute of the main wave hit dirt. The jumpmaster moved to the door and leaned out, scanning the path ahead. His stance was steady, one hand on the frame, the other holding to the edge as the wind whipped at his gear. Paige adjusted her own harness once more, fingers running each line in sequence, not because she doubted them, but because each check was another barrier against error. Outside, the ridges seemed closer now, their shadowed slopes revealing more detail as the sky behind them shifted from deep indigo to a thin, steel gray. Another voice came over the intercom, this time the pilot's, confirming final approach. Paige shifted her weight forward. Boots braced for the signal. The aircraft's interior seemed smaller now, the hum of the engines louder, the red light more vivid against the muted gear. This was the moment where precision mattered most, where chaos waited just past the door but had not yet claimed the operation. The harness felt tight across her chest, the mask steady against her face, and she let the last breath settle before the call would send her into the air. The jumpmaster's arm came up, a sharp movement against the dim red glow inside the bay. Paige shifted forward, boots hitting the deck with the familiar heaviness of a loaded jump, her body leaning into the line that would take her to the edge. The open air beyond was a shifting darkness, the ridgeline forming jagged black teeth under a sky beginning to fade from deep indigo to violet. She caught the motion of his hand, "Go," and stepped into the void. The roar of the engines vanished in an instant, replaced by the rushing wind that wrapped around her and pulled at every strap and seam of her gear. The cold hit her skin like a sudden shock, sharp enough to make her jaw tighten beneath the mask. She angled her shoulders, feeling the air take her. The horizon tilting as the valley spread out below in shadows and muted shapes. The freedom of the fall was both absolute and dangerous. Every second, a measure of how quickly she could adapt to what she could not control. Her hand found the release at the right moment, and the canopy cracked open above her with a hard snap, the harness biting into her shoulders and thighs as it took her weight. The sudden drag slowed her descent, and the rush of air became a steady scream in her ears, the lines of the chute shivering in the shifting wind. She looked up once, confirming the canopy's full bloom, the pale fabric almost glowing in the thin violet light of pre-dawn. The suspension lines trembled under the pull of the cross-current, and she felt the first strong tug taking her off her intended course. She gripped the toggles, easing one down and lifting the other, trying to counter the drift without overcorrecting. The wind was not steady. It came in irregular pushes, as if funneling through unseen gaps in the ridges. The altimeter on her chest was ticking down faster than she liked. The needle sliding past marks she knew too well. Her original landing zone was slipping away in her mind's map, replaced by the reality of where the wind was sending her, closer to the ridge that hid the mortar pits. Below, the shapes of other paratroopers spread across the air, their canopies forming brief pale arcs that caught the light before dropping into shadow. Some had steadier paths, farther out toward the safer slope, but a few, like her, were fighting the same unpredictable push. She caught sight of one canopy flare in a gust, then correct and level again. The spread of bodies across the air was measured chaos, each one working their own angles, trusting the others to hold to their roles once they hit the ground. The valley's floor was a mottled blend of rock, scrub, and the low swirl of fog that shifted in the weak dawn light. Farther up the slope, she saw movement, dark figures adjusting positions, the gleam of metal catching the light for a fraction of a second before vanishing. She knew that shape and sheen. Mortar crews were up and ready. The ridgeline above them was a sharp edge against the brightening sky, a hard boundary that marked both their range and her approach. Another gust hit, stronger this time, pulling her right and dropping her closer to the slope than she wanted. She leaned into the toggles, her body angling as the canopy responded with a slow, steady turn. The strain ran through her shoulders, the lines creaking under the load. She kept her eyes on the ground, reading the terrain, searching for a landing spot that would give her cover without forcing her into a full sprint toward her route. Her breathing stayed even, the mask's pull grounding her in the middle of the descent. She could feel the difference between the planned path she had held in her head and the shifting path reality was forcing on her. The discipline was in accepting it without panic, shaping her landing to suit what was given. Precision was not about holding the plan untouched. It was about adjusting in motion and making the new path work. She checked the altimeter again, noting how quickly the final stretch was coming. The fog would help conceal her landing, but it would also muffle sound in ways that could make enemy movement harder to pinpoint. She marked the spots where the rock gave way to scrub, where shadows pooled deeper against the slope. Every piece of information now would save seconds later, and seconds could mean survival. The ridge loomed larger with each passing second, the mortar pit area hidden behind the curve but still too close for comfort. She saw another paratrooper land far off to her left, the canopy collapsing into the ground like a folding wing before vanishing from sight. The wind shifted again, lighter now, giving her a moment of steadiness as she adjusted her descent toward a narrow strip of broken ground. The chute lines whispered in the air, the canopy breathing with each subtle shift. She could hear her own breath against the steady rush, counting down the last moments before impact. Below, the texture of the ground grew sharper, the rocks more distinct, the shadows between them deeper. She felt the tension in her legs building for the landing, her hands tightening on the toggles, the rhythm of movement narrowing to these last controlled motions before she hit. Somewhere beyond her line of sight, the mortar crews continued their work, unaware that one more shadow was about to slip into their valley. The ridgeline, sharp and unbroken against the lightening sky, was a reminder of how thin the margin would be once her boots touched earth. She focused on the landing, drawing in one last steady breath as the ground rose to meet her. The ground came up hard and uneven, sending a sharp jolt through Paige's knees as her boots struck the slope. She bent into the landing, letting her momentum carry her forward just enough to keep her balance before snapping the chute lines in quick, practiced motions. The canopy crumpled beside her, pale fabric folding in on itself until it lay still against the shale. She dropped to one knee and pulled it toward her, hands moving with deliberate precision, knowing that every second the bright material lay exposed was another chance for it to catch an enemy's eye. The chute folded tight under her fingers, each crease pressed down to keep it compact as she shoved it deep into her ruck. The pack swallowed the bulk of the fabric, leaving only the lines coiled in the side pouch. She pulled the zipper closed, listening for the faint rasp of teeth locking together, then settled the weight high on her back. The harness straps dug into her shoulders, the load now balanced for movement, and she adjusted them without looking away from the slope above. A faint metallic clink carried through the air, distinct even over the muted wind, followed by the low murmur of voices in a language she could not quite make out. The sound told her more than sight could. The crews were active, close enough that their work carried down to her without the wind scattering it. She stayed still for a breath, letting her eyes adjust to the dim light, watching for the flicker of movement that might mark a sentry. Nothing showed, but the noise confirmed her earlier read. She had landed closer to the mortar pits than she would have chosen. Loose shale shifted under her boots as she began to move, each step measured to avoid sending a cascade of noise down the slope. Patches of scrub broke the terrain, the leaves whispering when brushed by her gear. The air still carried the faint scent of aviation fuel from the aircraft. A thin reminder of how quickly the world had changed from the enclosed bay to this exposed slope. The oxygen mask's imprint still lingered against her skin, a slight pressure that kept her anchored in the sequence of moments leading to now. She kept her profile low, shoulders bent forward to blend her outline with the jagged rise of the ridge. Moving in short bursts, she crossed from one patch of cover to the next, never lingering in open space longer than it took to choose the next point. The ridge shadows offered concealment, but they also meant blind angles. She moved with the awareness that someone above could be doing the same, looking for movement where shadow met rock. The mortar pit came into partial view as she eased behind a split boulder. A tarp was stretched between two posts, its edges weighted with rocks to keep it from snapping in the wind. Beneath it, the outline of a tube rested on its bipod, its base plate pressed into the dirt. Ammo crates sat stacked too high near the rear, and dark shapes moved around them with the efficiency of people who had done this often. The crews kept their voices low, but the rhythm of their movements told her they were close to ready. Paige shifted her ruck slightly, the weight settling more evenly as she crouched. The path ahead sloped down before curling back up toward the outcrop she had marked on her map as the Overwatch point. She could not see it yet, but she knew its position in relation to the mortar pits and the landing zones beyond. Reaching it without drawing attention was the only way to make her presence count when the first wave dropped. Her hand went to the small push to talk on her harness, the button's surface smooth beneath her glove. She kept her voice low, just above the sound of her own breathing, sending the signal she had cleared the landing and was moving. 2 mics to position. The words were quiet, clipped, and vanished into the static as she released the button. No response came back, and she had not expected one. This was a confirmation, not a conversation. The route narrowed where the slope pinched between 2 stone shelves. She paused, listening, then edged through with her back to the wall and her eyes scanning the open space beyond. A single step sent a trickle of shale down the incline, and she froze until the sound died. Only when she was certain nothing had shifted above did she move again, keeping her weight light on each step. The higher she climbed along the angled route, the more the terrain opened toward the valley below. Through the gaps in the rock, she could see the low fog rolling in irregular swells, lit faintly from the east where the sky was beginning to pale. The landing zones lay beyond the fog, invisible now, but marked in her mind with precise coordinates. The thought of paratroopers dropping into that space while the mortars were still operational pushed her forward. She reached another cover point and crouched behind a slab of stone, checking the alignment of her route against the map in her head. The wind at this elevation was cooler, tugging at loose strands of her hair and carrying the muted rhythm of the enemy crews. Somewhere above, a metallic click rang sharper than the others, followed by a pause that stretched long enough to make her wonder if they had heard something. She waited, unmoving, until the familiar murmur of voices resumed. From here, the final approach to the Overwatch point would be in full view of the ridge if she misstepped. She studied the angles, choosing the path that kept her in the deepest shadows, then adjusted the straps on her ruck one last time. The slope would not forgive carelessness, and neither would the crews working above. She exhaled once, steadying herself, and began the final crawl toward the rock outcrop that would let her watch the valley without being seen. Paige eased herself onto the flat of the rock outcrop, keeping her weight low so her silhouette blended into the jagged line of the ridge. The stone was rough beneath her elbows, its edges catching against the fabric of her sleeves as she slid into position. From here, the entire sweep of the valley opened below her. The floor stretched in muted grays and pale blues under the fading night. The mortar pits were close enough that she could see the crew's heads turn as they worked, their movements crisp and methodical. She set the rifle down and adjusted the bipod legs until they settled into the uneven rock, one leg biting into a crack for stability. A faint gust swirled dust around her forearms, reminding her how easily the wind could shift a shot. She pressed her cheek against the stock, her eyes falling into the narrow circle of the scope, and the world beyond it faded until only the target space remained. The spotter was visible first, bent over a range board, a faint glint of metal catching in the corner of his position. Her sweep carried on to the 2 gunners. One worked the nearest tube, his posture squared and steady, while the other shifted between checking the weapon and glancing at the ridgeline. The mechanics of their preparation were precise. Shells moved from crates to the ready rack, hands checking each for weight and alignment. Paige tracked each in turn, measuring the pace and where the bottlenecks in their work might appear. She knew which one would be her primary and which would follow if the timing allowed. The wind coming off the valley mouth was restless, changing tone as it pushed through the broken rock formations around her. It hissed over the bipod legs, tugged at the stray ends of her hair, and sent small eddies of dust curling toward the landing zones far below. Through the scope. The light was beginning to shift, dawn's first color stretching thin across the horizon. It was enough to sharpen the edges of her targets, but it also meant her own position would soon lose the full cover of shadow. Her hand went to the small radio unit tucked close to her shoulder. The voice in her earpiece was clear and controlled, confirming the first wave was 3 minutes out. The number settled into her mind like a mark on a clock. Each second from now on counted against the threshold. She acknowledged with a brief click, then shifted her focus back to the glass, letting her breathing slow until it matched the steady rhythm she had trained into muscle memory. She began the calculations, her mind running through the known distances, the arc of the valley, and the erratic push of the wind. The ridge between her and the far side of the pits was steep enough to funnel the gusts upward, which meant any shot taken in that direction would lift slightly before dropping. She adjusted her scope half a notch and took the time to verify against the terrain features she had marked earlier. The dust patterns below confirmed her read. The gusts were uneven, but predictable enough to plan around. Every movement from the crews was logged in her head. The spotter kept glancing at the open ground beyond the pits, perhaps marking where the first wave might drop. One of the gunners was more focused on the weapon than his surroundings, his hands quick but precise. The second gunner moved between the stacks of shells in the firing position, his back turning to her with each trip. She knew their rhythms now, the small windows where they would be still long enough for a clean shot. She settled deeper into the rock, adjusting her elbows until they found solid anchor points. The stone was cool under her forearms, grounding her in the moment. Her breathing stayed even, the sound of it quiet beneath the low hum of the wind and the occasional clink of metal from below. The rifle felt steady, its weight an extension of her own frame, the scope narrowing her attention until nothing existed beyond the circle of glass. For a moment, she let her gaze drift to the horizon, where she knew the first parachutes would appear. They were not visible yet, but she could picture them, canopies blooming against the early light, each one carrying someone who would depend on her to keep the mortars silent. The thought did not tighten her grip or quicken her pulse. It sharpened her focus, drawing every detail of the scene below into sharper relief. The wind shifted again, a slow push from the east that carried the smell of earth and smoke. Paige adjusted for it without thought, the corrections as much a part of her as the steady press of the stock against her shoulder. She checked her holdover, confirmed her windage, and locked the numbers in her mind. The first target was clear, the second lined in her peripheral view, and the path between them mapped with the same precision as her route across the ridge. She blinked once, clearing the slight dryness from her eyes, and returned to the scope. The crews below had no idea she was there, no hint in their movements that they suspected the ridge above was already watching. The moment before the action was always the longest, suspended between preparation and commitment. She let the stillness settle around her, the rifle ready, the targets fixed, and the clock in her head counting down toward the moment when the valley would change. The first light slid over the far ridge, brushing the mortar pits in a pale gold that made every edge and contour stand out. The crews below moved faster now, their preparations entering the final sequence. Through the scope, Paige saw the spotter lean over the board again, one hand lifting to signal a ready mark. Her breathing steadied, each inhale matching the familiar rhythm she had drilled into herself so many times before. The radio crackled in her ear, the voice calm but edged with urgency. Hammer 1, go. The words dropped into her focus like a starting tone, and her finger tightened on the trigger. The shot broke clean, the recoil settling into her shoulder without pulling her from the target. Through the scope, she saw the spotter drop backward, his signal hand falling limp to the side. She shifted to the second target without hesitation, sliding the crosshairs onto the gunner at the second mortar tube. He was mid-motion, hands on the base plate, eyes fixed on the open ground ahead. The wind funneled through the valley in a sharper gust. And she adjusted, half a breath, before taking the shot. The round struck true, and the man folded over the weapon, the tube tilting uselessly against its mount. The crews reacted instantly, their movements sharp and uncertain as they searched for the source. Voices rose in shouts, overlapping as men pointed toward the ridge and then back to the pits. One man scrambled for cover behind an ammo crate while another tried to steady the unmanned tube. Paige ignored them both, her attention shifting to the far side where the third crew was aligning their weapon. She adjusted her scope, compensating for the increased distance and the way the wind curled around the rock formations between them. The third gunner was crouched low, hands gripping a round that he was about to load. The angle was tight, with only a narrow gap between the rocks to place the shot. She waited until he leaned slightly forward, the opening clear, then pressed the trigger. The impact sent him sprawling back into the shadows, the round rolling harmlessly down the slope. His partner grabbed him by the vest, dragging him behind the nearest crate while glancing nervously toward the ridge. The mortar remained idle, its alignment incomplete. Paige exhaled once, letting the rifle settle, then scanned the field to confirm no other immediate threats to the landing zone. Movement caught her eye above the fog layer, dark shapes descending in the first wave. The parachutes bloomed in the morning air, each one a fragile circle carrying someone down into the fight. The wind tugged at their fabric, shifting them slightly. But their lines held. Below, the troops in the pits shouted and scattered, some diving for cover, others abandoning their posts entirely. The valley erupted with overlapping noise. Her rifle's sharp cracks cut between the deeper thunder of explosions from the ridgeline and the heavy thump of weapons fire from the supporting aircraft. Dust rose in swirling patterns across the landing zones, pulled apart by the irregular wind. The air carried the smell of cordite and churned soil, each gust shifting the scent before she could get used to it. Paige tracked one of the retreating mortar crew as he tried to circle toward another position. He carried a shell in one hand, clearly intending to bring it to a still-functioning tube. She led the target by a fraction, timing her shot to catch him just before he reached the next weapon. The round struck, and he crumpled into the dirt, the shell rolling from his grip. Through the scope, she could see the second wave of parachutes beginning to appear, their descent still too high to be threatened by small arms fire. The first wave was hitting the ground now, landing in staggered arcs that matched the pre-planned drop pattern. She caught glimpses of figures collapsing their canopies and moving toward the first cover points. The discipline of their training evident in the smoothness of their motion despite the chaos around them. The mortar pits were all but silent now, the crews either down or scattered into the terrain. Paige shifted her position slightly to get a better angle on the approaches to the landing zones, her rifle ready to pick off any threat that tried to close the distance. Her breathing stayed even. The old memory of the oxygen mask's rhythm still steadying her mind. The valley was not yet secure, but the worst of the opening danger had been cut off before it could reach the descending troops. For a moment, she let herself register the way the early sun cut across the valley floor, casting long shadows behind the figures moving through the dust. The parachutes still drifting to earth were like fleeting signals of how close this moment had been to going wrong. She kept her eyes on the scope, searching for any movement that did not belong. The fight was still in its first minutes, and she knew there was no space yet for relief. Smoke drifted in slow, uneven sheets across the valley floor, stirred by the wind into pale ribbons that cut between the moving shapes of friendly troops. The dust from the landings still hung in the air, thickening the light until the horizon was a muted blend of gold and gray. Paige kept her cheek pressed to the stock, her scope tracking across the field with unbroken patience. The mortar pits below her were abandoned now, tubes overturned and ammunition left scattered in the dirt. Through the glass, she caught movement on the far slope, a small squad slipping low along the contour, angling toward the landing zone's flank. Their shapes were half lost in the haze, visible only when they crossed patches of open ground. She shifted her rifle slightly, adjusting her position so she could cover their path without losing sight of the valley's center. Her voice over the radio was quiet, delivering coordinates with clipped precision, the kind of message meant to be understood without further explanation. A brief pause. Then, an acknowledgement in her ear. On the ground, one of the lead squads shifted formation, a subtle tilt of a helmet toward the ridge her position occupied. It was not a wave, not an overt signal, but enough to mark that they knew she had eyes on their threat. Paige exhaled slowly, reacquiring her targets through the scope, the crosshairs following the squad's staggered advance. Each movement below was measured against the speed of the ground team's adjustment. The wind brought the faint clatter of gear from the abandoned pits, a reminder of how quickly the fight had shifted. Empty tubes and scattered shells were proof of a success that had been minutes from slipping away. Her focus didn't drift to it for long. The far squad was still moving, still hunting for a position. She adjusted her bipod a fraction, settling back into the stability of the rock. On the horizon, dark dots began to appear. The second wave, drifting into shape as parachutes opened in the upper air. She noted their position automatically, gauging their descent against the threat still moving on the ground. The rifle remained steady beneath her hands, its scope an unblinking eye over the valley. The battle's pace had shifted, but her role had not.